It is possible to predict the future. Not with crystal balls or by finding secret messages from God in your Cheerios, but simply by understanding that causes precede effects. The more causes you account for, the more likely you will determine the inevitable effect that results from their combination. Granted, one miscalculated cause in the present can ruin the long-term effect, which is why the number of people who can accurately predict the future is so infinitesimally small. Regarding temperament, a prophet tends to be off the scale in terms of conscientiousness and openness, with a level of creativity that surpasses almost anybody on the planet. They are entrepreneurs, scientists, artists, and philosophers, whose works we will be discussing centuries from now. In researching these types of people, I have noticed a pattern amongst the handful of people who accurately prophesy some sort of disaster. They are well aware that many people will not understand or accept their predictions, that their predictions will cause them financial, reputational, or health-related strife. Nonetheless, they figure that self-sacrifice will be worth it if there's a chance they may, at best, enlighten the masses, or at least save a few lives. I will cite an example that will be relevant to this video's main topic. On this channel, I have frequently discussed the themes of a video game called Metal Gear Solid 2. The game's creator, Hideo Kojima, wrote a story that predicted with uncanny accuracy the way the age-old problem of misinformation would grow out of control in the internet era, largely because we would be able to more easily consume information that caters to our emotional biases, rather than information that conveys uncomfortable truths. To get his point across, Kojima and his team advertised the game to make it seem like you would play as the main character from the first game, which is what most fans wanted. But when you actually played the game, you ended up playing as a completely different character about 85% of the time. Though this was done to make the gamer reflect on Kojima's greater point regarding misinformation, there were still people who completely missed out on that point, and were distracted by their bitterness over the game's quote-unquote false advertisement. Since making those videos, I've been asked if there were artists who preceded Kojima in making and suffering for that prophecy, but outside of maybe Warren Spector and his game Deus Ex, I was unaware. Thankfully, a friend of mine named David helped provide me with an additional answer to this question by alerting me to the works of somebody who I had always heard of, but whose work I had never consumed. That artist was the famous movie director David Cronenberg, and that famous work was the 1983 science fiction horror film Videodrome. Like with Metal Gear Solid 2, Videodrome predicted a future where the world would drown in a flood of misinformation and be unable to distinguish fact from fiction. But it also predicted other obvious consequences that Metal Gear neglected. Primarily, alongside that flood of misinformation would be an inevitable flood of overstimulation, brought about by easily accessible programming that would satisfy every niche and soothe every bias. The result would be a society constantly looking for new highs, until each person would be struck with an irreversible addiction that rendered them physically and mentally decadent. Now, because the film was released in 1983, it's quite obvious that Cronenberg had trouble conceiving of things like the internet, and the way it would create this overstimulated society via social media, YouTube, and easy access to pornographic material. But like with most forms of prophetic science fiction, the details might be incorrect, but the concepts are sound. In order to explain why that is, it would serve those familiar and unfamiliar with Videodrome to hear a quick synopsis. The film begins with a character named Max waking up in his apartment. Within the first few moments of being introduced to Max, it quickly becomes clear that he isn't very concerned with things like class, morality, or his personal health. His apartment is littered with suggestive images of women. His breakfast consists of stale pizza crust, which he dips in his coffee. Nowhere is his sleazy behavior more apparent, however, than at his job. Max is the president of a small Toronto-based television station named Civic TV. Despite its small size, Civic TV is able to survive by providing a niche audience with content that they have a hard time finding anywhere else. Specifically, stuff like soft pornography and harder violence than most TV stations would allow. After having viewed this type of highly stimulating content for a while, Max finds himself wanting to provide something, well, to use his words, tougher. Something that will provide him and his audience with the invigoration that they have been progressively lacking. One day, Max meets with Harlan, the operator of Civic TV's satellite dish. Harlan wanted to alert Max to a random signal that he picked up. When the connection to this signal is made, Max sees a woman being violently tortured. Instead of recoiling in horror like any normal person would, Max becomes excited. Assuming that the content is faked, he figured it could provide Civic TV with an enormous economic opportunity. Not only is it cheap to produce, it would satisfy a niche audience. Best of all, he could show this type of content with a clean conscience, because as he says during a late-night talk show appearance, it's better for the people who enjoy this type of thing to have a healthy outlet than to actually perform these types of acts. But in order to secure the rights to air it, he has to find out who is producing it. Max asks a business associate of his named Masha to try to use her connections to figure out who is producing Videodrome. After looking into it, she warns Max that Videodrome is probably something that should be left alone, primarily because of the, quote, philosophies of the people that produce it. Despite her warnings, Max pushes her to tell him who is behind it, to which she reveals a single name, Brian Oblivion. He instantly recognizes Brian's name because he was on the aforementioned talk show with Max, albeit on a television screen. As he begins to seek out Brian, Max begins to experience a series of hallucinations. Things like his television breathing, or him slapping his assistant only for her to tell him that he didn't do such a thing. From this point on, Max must push past his hallucinations to find their source, and determine if, as he suspects, they have anything to do with Videodrome. Now, unfortunately, I cannot explain Videodrome's prophetic elements without spoiling major aspects of the movie. Normally, at this point, I would say go watch the movie first, so you don't spoil yourself. However, I'm going to say for only the second time ever that I think you can watch my video and still end up appreciating the movie a great deal. It's one thing to have the movie's message spelled out, but it's another thing to experience the unique, horrific, and confusing way that Cronenberg presents that message. Still, if you would rather know nothing, bookmark this video and go watch it for yourself. It's less than 90 minutes long and it's well worth your time. So, what is Videodrome, and what does it have to do with Brian Oblivion? In the movie, Brian Oblivion is a famous professor of media. For many years, Brian predicted the irreversible stranglehold that television would have on society. A stranglehold that would be brought on by people seeking a variety of fictional and non-fictional programming to cater to their every bias and interest. The result would be a world where every person was less invested in reality and more invested with the world presented to them from behind a screen. After all, television can present ideal fictions, be it through traditional comedies and dramas, or warped perspectives on actual reality, fueled by biased journalists, pundits, and entertainers. Seeing no way out of this, Brian felt that the best thing one could do is embrace this change, use it to evolve humanity in a positive way. To do this, he worked with tech moguls behind the scenes to create Videodrome. But how would Videodrome's extreme violence promote humanity's evolution? Well, in Cronenberg's fiction, that extreme imagery apparently opens up certain sectors of the brain that are normally closed off. This permits the entry of certain wavelengths, which supposedly create brain tumors. These tumors can then be controlled by external parties by more wavelength inputs, generating hallucinations. Brian saw these hallucinations as the next step in human evolution. If human beings prefer false realities, then it would be better to embrace those false realities and find ways to use them to elevate the human condition, a possibility that we will explore in greater detail later on. Unfortunately for Brian, he found out that the people he was working with to build Videodrome's mind control technology were looking to use it for other purposes. One such person was a character named Barry Convex. He, amongst others, saw that television was turning the Western world soft, while the rest of the world was growing tougher. He wished to use Videodrome to forcefully rehabilitate society's softest and most degenerate, to make them turn away from overstimulating and ultimately harmful content. Disagreeing with this approach, Brian tried to stop his associates, only to be killed by his own invention before he could do so. Thankfully, before he died, Brian recorded tens of thousands of videotapes so that he could maintain the illusion that he was still alive and continue to influence the world so that it might learn to embrace his ideology. Max finds himself caught between this battle of wills. The people working for Brian's cause want Max to kill his opposition before their widespread mind control plans can be achieved, while Barry and his team want Max to kill Brian's team before their plans of willful hallucination can be achieved. Both parties tried to exert influence over Max by triggering a hallucination, where he perceives a videotape being inserted into his stomach. A tape that would bend Max's will to match their own. This is what I was getting at before when I said the details of Cronenberg's predictions were incorrect, but his concept was sound. Again, maybe he couldn't predict the form the internet would take back in 1983, or if he did, maybe he thought the inserting of videotapes into people's stomachs would get his point across, while also giving him the excuse to provide his trademark body horror. Whatever the case may be, the message is clear. Cronenberg understood, just as his character Brian Oblivion understood, that the world would grow to prefer the illusions presented to us behind the screen, for the stimulation and comfort it would gift us, potentially culminating at a point where true reality would forever be lost. In this way, Videodrome envisioned a future where there was an abundance of fictional and distorted non-fictional programming. The only difference is that instead of television and tumors, it's social media and influencers. Instead of hallucinations, it's people offering up their own biased perspectives on reality, ones that we adopt and pretend are our own. And just like with the world of Videodrome, this omnipresent programming in our world is creating an overstimulated and lazy populace that does everything they can to avoid pain, regardless if that pain is a side effect of a necessary medicine. Cronenberg understood this 40 years ago, and just like Kojima and others like him, Cronenberg sacrificed a lot to make this prophecy. He made the film with a bare-bones budget. He constantly rewrote the script during the process of filming, and then barely reaped any of the money back at the box office. Thankfully, he persevered so he might not only warn us, but give us enough time to think of a solution. Let's review Brian and Barry's solutions first before we try to come up with one of our own. Barry's solution is very much like the one that the antagonists from Metal Gear Solid 2 provide. Both of them believe it is necessary to prevent people from seeing overstimulating, degrading, and false content in order to steer them away from decadence. This would, of course, encroach on the human ability to make their own choices. But given society's overall decline, maybe humanity has abused that freedom too much that they have lost the moral right to it. As for Brian, he believes human beings should be able to choose their illusion to reach higher forms of consciousness. There is a compelling method the movie presents by which Max does exactly this. Towards the end of the movie, Max is told that he can reach a higher form of consciousness by self-terminating. In this scenario, one of two things can happen. This act could result in Max's death, but that is only if the act is actually happening. If the act is a hallucination, it could propel Max's consciousness to a state not unlike the Buddhist nirvana, where you leave the world of illusion behind and achieve a greater reality. But still, the result isn't certain, and is, in a way, forced upon Max. As for my opinion on this matter, I believe Barry and Brian both have reason to suspect humanity's ability to regulate itself. Though I, like Max, am of the belief that people should have the right to consume what they want, it is certainly true that people, including myself, often succumb to the predations of content that is not good for us, be it for our health or our intelligence. Humans have inevitably consumed information about our world that isn't true because it suits our biases, and that is especially true in the modern age, where we suffer a deluge of incorrect information on a daily basis. But just because we have difficulty discerning reality from fiction, that doesn't mean we should give up our right to choose. It doesn't mean we should further corrupt our perceptions of reality vis-a-vis Brian's will, or have somebody else tell us what is good for us via Barry's will. It is up to us to say no to both and foster a third path, where we can strengthen our resolve, where we can discern true reality for ourselves and others, and let that true reality serve as a beacon to guide our way. It may seem impossible, given our current circumstances. It might really seem like we are stuck with a binary choice, like a coin flip. But even a coin can land on its edge.